Hello, Earthlings, Adam and Akbar. Welcome to episode 23 in our course on philosophy of climate change. We are in our module on climate policies. We've talked in general terms about what are the main kinds of policies, what are the levers that we can pull, what are the buckets that we can put different policies into, like mitigation, adaptation, geoengineering. We moved into the Paris Climate Agreement. We then focused on the US with the Green New Deal. And that brought us up to right now to carbon pricing and beyond, or what we might call the Green New details. We're going to kind of build off of what we've done with the Green New Deal with a focus still on the US and talk about a real shift that's happened recently in the way climate policy is being done on the left in the US. So let us jump into it. What I'm really doing now is I assigned this article for you to read by David Roberts. You know he's one of my favorites. And there's tons of links in there that are worth following. I put some of them in your notes also that I think are particularly important. So really one of our goals is just to really understand this piece because there's a lot in there that's important. Here's what we want to do. Explore this new climate policy renaissance or paradigm shift that's emerging on the left in the US. So we will have accomplished our goal if you feel like you learned something about this shift that's happening in the way climate policy is being thought about, particularly on the liberal Democrat left side of politics in the US. So start by saying, why focus just on the left? And then we're going to dig into this, what I'm calling a renaissance or a paradigm shift, or however you want to think about it. From Roberts, two principles. Then we're talking about we're shifting away from carbon pricing. Well, what is that and why are we moving beyond it? Then we're going to think of this renaissance in broad terms, with a nod to my favorite, one of my heroes, Alexander Hamilton. Then we'll get back to specifically the Roberts article and talk about these three pillars. So he's got two principles of this renaissance and three pillars. And at the very end, he's got, I think, 5 remaining points of debate, disagreement, or contention. So these pillars are really a new consensus of this climate policy framework. But there's other things that are less of a consensus, right? So we'll end with those. Okay, so why the left? Well, because climate change has become just super hyper partisan issue, sadly, in the US, and the Republican Party just doesn't take it seriously. I don't know how to sugarcoat that one. This is from the 2016 Republican Party platform, which is the same as the 2021. There are 7 mentions of climate change, and all of them are dismissive. Right? Climate change is far from the nation's most pressing national security issue. The United Nations IPCC is a political mechanism, not an unbiased scientific institution. We demand a halt of US funding for the UNFCCC. So, you're just not going to get a policy renaissance out of this platform, right? Not going to happen. So that's why we're focusing on the left. It's just so partisan. I'm not happy about it. I don't know what to say about it, though. Here it is. This is, by the way, one of Roberts' main points. Okay, so I'm in his article already talking about. This is why he says I'm focusing on the left, because you're just not going to get ideas coming out of the right in this generation of leaders. Okay, I linked to this in your notes on the right side of this slide. There is a promising generational shift, I think, in the Republican Party, where younger Republicans are taking climate change seriously and thankfully are bringing their ideas to bear in terms of how to think through the policy dynamics of this. So I suspect in a few years, hopefully, we won't just be focusing on the left, that we will have some bipartisan discussions going on. But right now, this is just where we are. And there's a flurry of climate policy activity on the left. Roberts mentions some of them. Most important ones, and I'm going to put them here. I think I put 4 of them here, and these are all linked into your notes. If you're into this, I think it's really interesting, go and dig around there. So you have Jay Inslee's presidential campaign, which really foregrounded and pushed climate change onto the agenda, ultimately of Joe Biden, but all the other candidates too. So this evergreen action is worth looking into. You have this development of this House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis from the Democrats, link in your notes. The Blue-Green Alliance, in other words, labor and environmental groups getting together with their policy platform and the Equitable and Just Climate platform of over 300 environmental organizations. So the new consensus, this renaissance in climate policy, has been cooked kind of from the bottom up through these coalitions, right? That's one of the points he's making. That's what it's given birth to, is this new renaissance. So what's happening? I'm going to give you a few different ways to see what's happening. One is to say we're going from the Green New Deal, which I said last time is really a platform. I mean, initially it was this resolution. It was kind of ambiguous. It was very aspirational and ideal. We're going from that now to the Green New details. That is, we're really starting to flesh out some consensus positions on some more specifics, tools and mechanisms and plans. So this new consensus, this paradigm shift is forming, and it's coalescing around these groups and around this general framework coming out of the Green New Deal. Okay, but what is it all about? Okay, from Roberts, he says, actually, he's got 3 principles. We already did the first one, which is that if you're going to have a good climate change policy idea now, it's going to come out of the left. Okay, just the way party dynamics are set up now. The other 2 principles, though, by the way, the first one is really important because it means anything that's going to have to get done is going to have to deal with the political constraints introduced by the Republican recalcitrant position, if not sometimes flat out denial around climate change. These other 2 principles, though, look, net zero by 2050. We talked about this a lot because this comes out of the report that you read, at least the summary for policymakers. That has had such a huge impact. That's one of the reasons I wanted you to read it. Robert says this wasn't part of the discussion a few years ago, and he's right. And this is really radical. In fact, it means policy radicalism, he says. So that's the first principle. The other is that carbon pricing has been dethroned. It's still there, but it's not at the center like it was before. And that's why I called this lecture that. So, but what is carbon pricing and why are we moving beyond it? Well, I think it's intuitive in some sense. It's any mechanism you can have that would put a price on carbon. And we've talked about this because carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are these externalities, right? They're not factored in. There's no price associated with them. This is true of pollution in general, right? And so one longstanding idea has been to remedy that kind of problem, you have to price it. In other words, you internalize the cost into the market transaction, right? So 2 main mechanisms for doing this is cap and trade. This was all the rage in climate policy until very recently, really. Or these emission trading schemes, it's the same thing. You have the government set a cap on how many greenhouse gas emissions can we have over the entire economy. And then you would lower that cap over time, but within that limited amount, you would allow the market freedoms to trade those carbon credits, essentially. The other mechanism would be a carbon tax, and there's lots of different ways of doing that. There's ways because taxes raise revenue. What are you going to do with that revenue? How do you invest it? Who do you pay with it? All of that. But those are the 2 main mechanisms of carbon pricing. Okay. Like I said, it's not dead. In fact, it's growing. I linked in your notes a World Bank report, World Bank Group report that talks about carbon pricing. In fact, it's taking off in many parts of the world. So to say beyond carbon pricing is a bit of a exaggeration because it's still there. And look, let's not take any options off the table, right? But in the US, and again, that's our focus, raising prices is a political non-starter. Back to our first point, maybe about the Republican Party, but more in general, nobody wants to pay higher prices, right? So we're not going to get this silver bullet, Roberts says, like one federal level cap and trade policy that will solve the problem. Instead, we're going to have a silver buckshot, that is, a whole bunch of good ideas that are going to have to work together. Here's this big picture way to understand the shift. And I think this is really key, and I linked to this article in your notes. The US maybe is going from a narrow technical market mechanism to make carbon more costly, so make carbon more expensive. We're going from that to big, complex industrial policy to make carbon-free energy cheap. Okay, that's the paradigm shift or the renaissance, or at least that's one way of seeing it, right? And this, I can't go into it here, but plug for my course I'm teaching next semester. This is Alexander Hamilton. This is the way he set up a burgeoning capitalist nation. You invest selectively in industries. You really move the elbow, as it were, of the invisible hand with the power of the government. And maybe, gasp, this could be a way to bipartisan consensus in the US because it's all about jobs, manufacturing, the heartland, the working class, made in America. So this could be a real winning way of framing climate change. Now, the three pillars. SIJ, the S, standards. He says, look, let's focus on the low-hanging fruit, electricity, cars, buildings. We already have ways of replacing those carbon emissions with carbon-free emissions that are pretty much economically ready to go. We just have to do these sector-specific, targeted standards and incentives. What would that mean? Well, the details can vary. But for example, in the electricity sector, you can have clean energy standards. It just says you have to have X% of your energy delivered from renewables, and then you can ratchet that up over time. You can also use EPA regulations like the Clean Power Plan, different ways to do it, right? Big picture here, next lecture, the vision is to electrify everything. Okay, so we'll get to that some more. The I, investments, good old New Deal style or Hamiltonian style, massive public investments in green infrastructure, green technology, green research. The key, this creates good jobs, right? And then that drives us to the J, justice. Now, this has always been part of the climate change discourse, but it's taken a more central role because economic or energy transitions always impact the working class hardest. And in particular, we're talking about how can we deal with unions, fossil fuel workers, right, and frontline communities. I think this is interesting. One of the lessons learned from the 2016 campaign for the Democrats was you can't start with emissions, eliminating emissions, right, carbon pricing, right, a narrow elimination of emissions strategy, and then think about, well, what does that do to the coal industry workers as an afterthought? Flip it around. Let's think about how do we have dignified, clean, green 21st century jobs for all Americans. Start there, right? And from that vision, get yourself off of fossil fuels. Right? That's, I think, another way of thinking about this paradigm shift. Okay, last thing, remaining debates. Look, yes, this is more detailed, it's promising, but there's so much more to flesh out. And even within the left, there will be these intranecine battles about what do we do with these things here. And he lists 5 of them. So just briefly, what about accountability for fossil fuel companies? Look, they knew for years and years, and yet systematically underplayed the risks of their product in terms of climate change. What do we do? Well, he mentions 3 things: lawsuits, getting the financial system to account for the climate risks of fossil fuel investments. That's an interesting one. I think I linked in your notes a place to follow up on that, or it's in that Roberts article. In other words, this whole financial sector has been under accounting for the risks posed by fossil fuels, and they're starting to wake up to that now. We've mentioned this before. And then a big one, ending fossil fuel subsidies, right? Gasoline is only so cheap because of all the things we don't build into the price of gasoline. Okay, what about supply side policies? Quote, keeping it in the ground, like fracking bans. What role should those play? Again, another point of debate. Carbon pricing. Okay, again, we're not really moving beyond it. We're just saying it's been decentered, but it still has a role to play. How would you structure it? Okay, there's debates around that. Nuclear power, big one. He mentions, and I think he's right, there's a kind of softening of attitudes towards nuclear power across the board, but especially on the left. It used to be anathema. It was, don't touch it. Nobody wants to do nuclear. Well, now even some of the most progressive voices are opening up to the possibility that we need nuclear. Why? Well, it's a largely carbon-free source of energy. Why not? It has a big waste problem, right? Of course, all energy has waste problems. Okay, last one, carbon capture, use, and sequestration. This may open a door towards bipartisan agreements because this is one of the things, carbon capture, that it's Republican interest. So that's worth thinking about. How would we do it? And in fact, we may have to do some significant sucking of carbon out of the atmosphere, right? According to what models you're looking at, how do we actually achieve the net zero objective? The 1.5C target, if we have any chance of hitting that, we're probably going to have to do some of this carbon capture and sequestration. But how, to what extent, right? Those are still debates. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the lecture on geoengineering coming up. So that's that. Last thing to say, look, this whole new paradigm shift towards SIJ, standards, investments, and justice. You can see it all still within this concept or this overarching umbrella of green growth. What they're talking about, jobs, manufacturing, right? A clean, green economy. They're talking about economic growth. Remember the iron law of climate change. Any climate policy has to be compatible with economic growth. I think that's the kind of realism underneath all of these policy frameworks here. As Akbar said, let's hope economic growth can be the solution to the problem it created in the first place. I do think that is our gamble on the grandest scale. I'm a little bit hopeful after reading this material and learning this stuff. Interested in what you think about it. Okay, that's probably enough from me. Until next time, be good and may the force be with you.